name is Dave Willer, and I'm the president. And so in terms of introductory announcements, just want to say that we're always looking for members. So our membership year is now on a calendar basis. So the membership year for 2022 started January 1st. So please, we encourage everyone here to take out their membership. We always attach it to our newsletter for those who are prior members and get the newsletter. It's also on our website. You can see that. So again, I encourage everyone to become a member. That helps us to put on events like this and send out our newsletter. And just want to remind everyone for next month, our presentation is on April 28th, again, for Thursday. And it's on the web, so you'll see the title of it is on the website. It's called Peeling Back 13,000 Years of Indigenous Existence in Niagara by Michelle Elise Burnett. So that will be our April presentation. Hope to see everyone there. And now we can focus on the March presentation. We'll have David Hemmings speaking today. David has spoken to us before, and we're really looking forward to this presentation. And I will ask Elizabeth to introduce David.
Hello. We're very pleased, as David said, to welcome back David Hemmings. He's spoken 3 or 4 times at least in prior years to our group, and he's always been very popular. I think my very favorite presentation of yours, David, was when you did your talk on McNabb, and everybody that ever lived at McNabb came in to that room. And it was probably the largest attendance I think we've ever had. It was just astonishing. Anyway, just a brief bio of David. He retired from building startup technology and service businesses in 2008. He has since written 8 local history books about the Niagara-on-the-Lake area. He has contributed 50 research papers for the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum's website. He was president, he's now past president of the Niagara Historical Society. He gives monthly genetic genealogy workshops at the Niagara-on-the-Lake Public Library. He has found the birth parents of 20 local adoptees using DNA analysis and other tools. In late 2018, David published the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museums on their website a single spreadsheet of Miss Rye's British home children, mostly girls, who came to Eastern Canada through a home in Niagara. In late 2021, he published a listing of life events for 1,200 of these girls who married. This extensive work has included researching and compiling Miss Rye's records, reports to and from government departments in Canada and Britain, ship's manifests, correspondence for 4,500 home children in Canada and Britain from the years 1868 to 1896. This was followed by a similar compilation of a further 1,000 children brought to Canada from 1897 to 1914, when the Church of England Waifs and Strays Society took over Miss Rye's home in Niagara when she retired. Most of these children were placed with families and on farms in Ontario until they were 18 years old. This topic is going to be the subject of David's presentation tonight. We look forward to hearing all about it. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Shall I go ahead and put up the screen? Get started?
Please do.
Let me pull it up here. Oh, I think this is it. How do I find it? Let me see. Excuse me a minute while I fiddle with this. Not quite sure why I can't see my own
There it
screen.
is. We can see.
You can see it now, can you?
Yep.
Good. And let me just a second here. Do one more thing. Is that better?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, good. So should I proceed?
Please do, as far as I'm concerned.
Great. Okay. This is a presentation that is sort of oriented to people who might want to do research about their grandmothers or great-grandmothers who may have come to Canada via the method that Maria Rye used, which was basically a sponsorship and chaperoning of young ladies all the way from the age of 3 to the age of mid-teens to come over to Canada because they were either orphans or they were unwanted. They were on the street in Britain, and the British government basically wanted them off the street and into their colonies. We were a colony in 1868 when this started. Maria Rye was the first person to do this work in sort of a large scale way. Previously, there had been ones or twos, but not at this sort of level. And so it required a lot of support from the British government, from sponsorship, from Canadian government, and so on and so forth. As we recall, Canada Confederation was 1867, which was actually the year before Maria Rye actually started bringing children here. And that was primarily the reason why she was able to do it so much more easily, because she could deal directly with John A. Macdonald and others. In fact, I have letters between Maria Rye and John A., and at least copied to John A. Macdonald. This first view is where the original distribution home was in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And it's the reason why I did the work, because there were so many of these girls that came through Niagara-on-the-Lake that they needed to be compiled and put together in a form that was readily accessible and researchable. We put a couple of plaques up in the park. It's at the sort of southeast side of Niagara-on-the-Lake, not far from East and West Line. And on the 28th of September 2018, which is the British Home Children's Day of the year, we put up these 2 plaques, courtesy of 2 very fine people in Niagara-on-the-Lake. The background is worth just going through a little bit here. London, I'm using London as the best example of an urban area, but there were numerous other urban areas like Manchester, Liverpool, etc., and so forth. And in the period of time that we're talking about, the stench in London was quite extraordinary. And finally, the government had to ask a man named Joseph Bazalgette to build a sewer system in London to take the sewage away from London instead of being dumped directly into the Thames. If you've been to London, you've probably stepped on the embankment, either on the north side or the south side, and you know that today the River Thames is very much contained within a certain space between those 2 embankments. That was all because Bazalgette used the embankments as the way, as the place in which he had the sewers, and also there was an underground that was put in there as well at the same time. And that's how they were able to do this rather than digging up all the streets everywhere, which they also had to do to some extent. The sewage system, as you can see, was quite extraordinary. The problem, of course, in those days was diseases. you can see on the right side there, there's examples of common diseases that you could get on the streets of London or any other major city in Britain. And down on the bottom right are houses that are actually back right up onto the shore of the River Thames at the time, back in the 1860s. And so literally the waste, the sewage, everything used to simply go in a bucket down to the bottom of the beach and into the river. This is what you would have expected to see if you'd gone to any major urban area in Britain at the time. I'm just trying to give you as many examples as I can. You would notice that there is a small culvert in the middle of the street. And that's where the waste, and the streets were typically angled so that all of the waste would end up going down those culverts down to the end of the street. And then there would be bigger culverts in larger streets to deal with that. So it just gives you an idea that, and by the way, if you were living on the bottom floor of these properties, you had to be awfully careful because the people upstairs might be throwing their bucket out the time you came out of the front door. So you do have to be really careful in those days about where you were going, where you were treading, etc., and so forth. And diseases were just rampant. So in addition to that, huge numbers of people across Britain, particularly in the urban areas, were paupers. There were such things as workhouses or unions, as they were referred to. And the problem with those workhouses was that if a family went in there, they were divided up between women and men, girls and boys, permanently from the time they walked in till the time they walked out, if they ever walked out. So in other words, you never saw your daughter or your son or your husband or your wife again once you got inside these workhouses, for the most part. There were exceptions to that, but on the whole, that was the case. And what you would see is top left, women all congregated together, top right, men doing trivial jobs, such as splitting wood, because they could make small amounts of money, pennies, on that firewood for the purposes of starting a coal fire in houses that had coal fires. The boys and girls, top center, just an example of what you would expect to see. And then a few of these who were considered more, these children who were considered more intelligent or bright than the others, bottom left, would have a chance to get out and go to perhaps an intermediary school. They might get a year or two's worth of education in. And then finally, in 1868, Maria Rye started to ship these girls to North America, to Canada, mostly. Shipping boys is one thing. Shipping girls is a very different matter, because, as is very obvious, girls procreate more girls and more children way too easily, and can get very easily sidelined on an urban street and be put in situations that you would not want them to be. So having put that as sort of a background, let's look at some of the laws that were being enacted about this time. We weren't quite at the advanced suffragette period, but we're getting up there. What was happening was that women were starting to, in some households, get out and be active in persuading the men folk, who were the only people that represented them at the time, to change some of the laws. And here you can see some of the laws as they progress through time. Just quite extraordinary. I mean, we really do not, I mean, let's take something start the very simple thing called the welfare state. The welfare state did not come in until 1948 in Britain and the 1950s in Canada. That means if you retired, you couldn't really retire because there was no pension, there was no government pension before that period of time. And in Canada, for example, before the Second World War, if you go talk to all your friends in McNabb, they'll tell you that all they had was horses and carts for the most part to do their farming. There was no automation of substance in those days before World War II. I'm not talking about World War I now, I'm talking about World War II. So we tend to forget what it was like just 80 years ago. And it's very hard to actually shift your thinking from the very pleasant environment in which we are today compared to the situations that we saw 80 to 100 years ago. Women themselves started to do things that were of substance. Florence Nightingale, I think we've all heard of. She started nursing in the way we know it today. Ada Lovelace was the first person to describe a computer. There was, of course, Mrs. Beeton, who wrote the first book on household management. And then there was this wonderful lady who was actually, she dressed herself up as a man. She graduated in medicine as a man, became the Surgeon General of the British Army and the Inspector General of Hospitals in Canada. And it wasn't until she died that they figured out that she was a woman. Sort of an amusing thing, because frankly, she would never have been allowed to do what she did had she been a woman at that time. And as we know, if you go back to the period of the Bronte sisters or some of the others, they had to have men's names in order to write books. So that's the way it was. And then on top of that, in Britain, Catholics had their own world, quite separate from much of the rest of Britain. For example, because of the teachings at Oxford University, the Vatican decided that Catholics should not go to Oxford University until 1895. So you had, on top of the sort of the Anglican-centric religious group, of which, by the way, Maria Rye was one of them. And then you had other people who had different opinions about how life should be led. Maria Rye herself was the eldest, and as a result felt somewhat obligated to lead families, the family siblings, particularly the girls, in doing something of value that they could offer the community. And she went off and she wrote a lot of, she started a legal typing and transcription organization. She did all sorts of publications and so on and so forth in the early days. And it suddenly struck her that girls in their early years, and particularly in their teenage years, had no real opportunity for progress. And so she decided to start this emigration project, and she got the help of her sisters to do it. Needless to say, father, who was an attorney, really only funded the boys in the family, and that was pretty common practice in those days. I just want to mention one person, Lizzie Still, who was her lifetime secretary. My goodness, amazing, for a very long period of time. The support that Maria Rye got was of her own doing. She was what we would call today an evangelical Anglican. She got the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Earl of Shaftesbury, and numerous other people to sponsor and fund the things that she was doing. And she was a brilliant person at promotion. She started out by taking young women to Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, but realized that it took 6 months round trip to go to any one of those places pretty much. And so the alternative seemed to be with a month round trip to go to Eastern Canada instead. And so that's what she decided to do. So the early 60s were very much on a smaller scale what she ended up doing starting in 1868 in Canada. So she'd already been doing this for a good part of that decade. By 1868, things were just getting pretty overwhelming. She was able to get the governments of each of the two countries to agree to allow for this emigration of girls, primarily girls, to take place. She would, at least in the early days, be taking somewhere between 80 and 150 girls per voyage. She was the only matron on board, and she had help from the senior girls. That was pretty much the only way she could afford to make this happen. Early voyages were in sailing ships, and they would take 2 to 4 weeks. The later steamships, you could pretty much rely on something around 10 days to 2 weeks. In 1869, thereabouts, Maria Rye started to look for a premises in Canada that she could bring her girls through, at least those that were not dropped off in Toronto and put to their placements directly. So she bought the old courthouse and jail in what is today Rye Park and made it and called it Our Western Home. And she also bought a house in Peckham, South London, which happens to be where my father was born. And it's a part of London that I used to manage customer services in for a London borough. And she and her sisters and her dedicated secretary got the movement going. So the word gutter children was commonplace in those days. It's not exactly the nicest description of girls today, but it's what they were referred to at the time. Here were the steamships that came along in the 1870s, thereabouts. And this was the Our Western Home in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And Emily Bailey was the superintendent hired for that purpose, and some of the girls in the top there. They made their own uniforms. In fact, they made all their own clothes. They weren't given anything. Everybody made their own. In terms of numbers of different homes that followed Maria Rye, Rye herself, her group of 5,300 that came through Niagara-on-the-Lake was comparatively small compared to, say, Dr. Bernardo's, which is a well-known organization today. The Catholic Emigration Society also was huge, and ultimately so was Marchmont Home as well in Belleville, run by Annie McPherson. And all of these different movements were in place, and they basically followed the Rye model in setting themselves up to bring the children to Canada. Here's one of the very first groups that came to Canada. We're not quite sure, but we think this is either 1869 or 1870. we're just beginning to get that there are actually precious few photographs available of the girls, and we're only now beginning through the families of these girls, descending families, are we beginning to find photographs that we can use to try to make comparisons with a photograph like this. Every Sunday, for those girls that were still here and had not been placed, they would go walk like this to St. Mark's Church, St. Mark's Anglican Church in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and they would be at the service every Sunday. The lady on the right-hand side is Mrs. Hannah Safi, who followed Maria Rye as the traveling matron across the Atlantic. She did somewhere around 30 voyages with these kids over her career. Maria Rye was, as I mentioned earlier, brilliant at promotion. She was also a good writer. And I've got a listing of about 200 of these sorts of articles in various newspapers that Maria Rye and others provided. And basically what it does is demonstrate that she was selling all the time. She was selling to get people to donate to her organization, and she was also selling to find the most appropriate people to bring to Canada as domestic servants. She always assumed that a good proportion of the domestic servants would ultimately get married, so that's why you see some of this information. You'll notice here, for example, she says in this particular article that she has 500 homes on her books waiting for future parties. That's nothing short of salesmanship. It was true. She actually had an extraordinary number of people on the list. And in fact, many of the girls actually never got as far as Niagara-on-the-Lake because they were dropped off in either Montreal or Toronto on the way. Some of the girls were either so young or were so unprepared that she would put them into Avenue House in London, South London, first and sort of help them get trained. Not that that would be a long period of time. It might typically be 2 or 3 months, but at least it would probably get the girl, unless she was 3 years old, but of which there were some, 3 or 4. But for a number of the girls who were, say, 6, 7, 8 and beyond, they could do, they were trained to sew, they were trained to do all the things that a domestic servant would be expected to do. And so that when they came over here, they were somewhat prepared. And because it was important that her, the recognition of what she was doing was properly upheld. Here you'll see that the advertisement that she put in was for ages 6 to 13. That was the optimum preferred age range, but I can tell you that she took in everybody from 3 to 18 if they needed a home somewhere in Canada. And because she had this huge list of people who wanted these girls to be placed with them, she was able to define which girls went to which homes, or which farms for that matter. So that it's just a start. Now the indenture process that Maria Rye used and was used for this general purpose is that when you were an adult, when you were 18, you were an adult, and as a result of that, you were free to go off and become a domestic servant or get married or whatever as you wished. However, many of these girls ended up by going from one placement to another all the way through their teenage years, in many cases of their own volition and not with the approvals of anybody. So in other words, if there was a home down the street that would pay her a small amount of money to assist in domestic service, for example, and that the people looked nicer than the people she was with at that time, that British home child would move from one place to another locally during that time. And in some cases, girls would actually leave at the age of about 15 and 16 and go to Toronto, bigger cities like Toronto and London and Hamilton, and find work as if they were 17 and 18-year-olds. So here's an example of just some of the very broad array of newspaper articles that we have on Maria Rye. All this information is in the Niagara on the Lake Museum, but to be honest with you, they come right back to me with any questions. So if you actually do have any questions at the end of this, I've left an email address, and I'm be delighted to help out anything that you may be interested in, which I'll comment again later. Now, this part of the presentation is about sources. Typically, Maria Rye herself would write out the information like this. This would be, in this case, the 1874, October 1874 SS Polynesian run to October's probably still okay. So he probably went to Quebec City. I can't remember on that particular one. Quebec City itself was usually closed between the mid-November and early April. So they had to go to Halifax instead. Unfortunately, Halifax didn't keep ships manifest before 1881. And so we've lost some records. The only way one can presume some of the names that are in the Maritimes, that is those that stayed in the Maritimes, is through the government inspectors' reports. This is an example of some of the people in this list were taken from Merthyr Tydfil Union. Merthyr Tydfil's in the South Wales coal valleys. And they would be ultimately found on the Maria Rye transportation lists. But this is typically what you'd see in a workhouse document. And you get some information from a workhouse document if you're researching it. Another example of the same sort of information. I would say on the whole, Maria Rye was happier with people off the street than with workhouse kids. The workhouse kids were very, they were simply harder to control. And it's not clear why it was, whether it was because of the circumstances that they went through during their experiences they went through during their early life or not. I'm not quite sure. But I would say that that was her comment in some papers that we have. She also wrote to various and sundry. This particular report is actually from the government inspector, and it starts to tell you, for example, that he had a devil of a job trying to get everywhere that he needed to go around the country, probably on horse or by foot, to see the kids in the places they were supposed to have been at. And frankly, he on the reports that we saw from these inspectors, there were a lot of blanks because they simply couldn't find the kids anymore. And they were even in the places they were supposed to be at. So that some of the kids who did go through Halifax ended up in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia primarily. There were a few in PEI, but not many. None that I know of in Newfoundland, but that may be incorrect. Typically New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. The rest of them, because there was a fairly big group that was a set of groups that were already in Quebec, and that Quebec was mostly Catholic. Most of the Catholic kids went to Quebec. And so since Maria Rye, as I mentioned earlier, was an evangelical Anglican, Ontario was a better place to be for her. It just gives you examples of these sort of reports, just so you can get some. I have every report I can find. It was a 2-year project. I have got absolutely everything sitting in my files here at home, which anybody can ask me to take a look at. Maria Rye also put together annual reports of her placements and movement of kids, the British Home Children, and you can see an example of that right here, just one of her reports. You can also see on another report here who her patrons and sponsors and the like are, and then you would find later on in this report pages and pages of patrons, people who were, sorry, I should say donors, people who were funding them and how much they funded Maria Rye's organization. So she was very good at not just persuading people to part with their cash to help with this initiative, but also to get the right sorts of sponsorship, the right sort of links into government, into the church, etc., and so forth, to help out on this whole endeavor. Here, as an example, is what happened after 1875. Before that, there was a report written by a British government inspector about these children. And from then, and because it stopped the whole process for about a year or two, Maria Rye decided that all kids and all placement heads of households should only have their initials on their information. And so the only way I was able to separate the home children's names was to take the ship's records, which were complete names and ages, and compare them to the initials and the ages in these reports. So most several thousand of these, I actually had to reconstruct in order to come up with the final information. But the other interesting thing about this is there is now information for many of the trips that were made about the circumstances from which these children came. You can see lots of fathers dead or mothers dead, or somebody's very ill, loads of kids. It was a horrendous situation in the back streets of the urban areas of Britain. The ship's manifest looked something like this. Of course, needless to say, you have to be able to read the handwriting. And I don't think anybody ever expected that anybody 150 years later would be reading the handwriting of people who put down the names in the ship's manifests. So to be honest, it was, you had to do it on a computer where you can pull the image up to something very large in order to actually be able to read some of these names, or at least interpret what they might be. And over time, other people have, in some cases, also looked at it too. So we've been able to make some comparisons with interpretations. But you can see here, for example, on the right-hand side, that Maria Rye had her girls on a ship at the same time as Bernardo had boys on the ship as well. So I can't imagine in third class what it must have been like with girls at one end with, keep your hands off. And at the other end, all the boys as well. It must have been quite an extraordinary 2 or 3 weeks to get these kids across the Atlantic. There were also a series of letters that Maria Rye wrote to the government. And you can see at the bottom right-hand side of this one, Sir John A. Macdonald is copied on this particular letter. So needless to say, Maria Rye was dealing at the highest levels of government when in being involved in this sort of work. In addition to which, you may ask the question, do we have a lot of letters written by these British home children? And the answer is sadly no. There were some letters in the early days that were compiled into a book, and I'm happy to send this book to anybody. It's about a 50-page book, but it does have some letters in it. The problem we all have with letters is that when you've got a 7, 8, 10-year-old kid writing a letter with not the best literacy, and having the placement mother or father standing over them while they write that letter, you can imagine they couldn't say anything bad if they wanted to. So the letters aren't exactly the letters that talk about the problems. They're the letters that talk about how nice everything is. All of this information is now compiled for Niagara on the Lake, for the Rye organization. The first database done in late 2018 is the one at the top. That has 5,300 children, of which 4,500 were brought by Maria Rye from 1868 until 1896, when she retired. Turns out she had stomach cancer and she died in 1903. There is also a sort of a research report of how this work got done, where all the sources are, that sort of thing, and how this was compiled. And that information is in the second document that you see there, the research on the children. The third one then, it takes as many as I could find. The problem with the period that we're talking about is that many kids got, quote, adopted, unquote. The problem is there was no formal regulated adoption until the late 20s or early 30s, 1930s I'm talking about. So certainly for all these kids, if they got adopted by a family, a placement, they may have had their names changed, both their surname and their first names. And the problem is that many of these girls, the moment they got off the ship, are sort of lost in the record somewhere. In other words, you'd have to do a great deal of work on an individual basis to try to find that person again. But I was able to find between that database and the next one, which was all those that I've proven to have remained unmarried in their lifetime, 1,400 girls who are of the 5,300, which is in excess of 25%. And the reason I did that second piece of work, which was came together at the end of last year, is because there are a few books out there that really talk about the serious problems that some British home children had. In other words, bad news always spreads, and a good book about how bad things were often does sell. And I wanted to sort of create a compilation of people who in fact got married and actually enjoyed life. They had kids, and I can tell you all of that information as well. And then, so in addition to which, Library and Archives Canada has now taken a link to the Niagara on the Lake Museum website, because they also want to present the information that's now available to their researchers as well. Here's an example of the very first page of, in 1868, of the first kids that came, when they weren't kids at that time. Actually, the average age in the one year of 1868 was about 21 years. But most of them were general servants. I have put in there sort of those that were married that I know of and their marriage date and place. And those you will see as marked with a green square on the left-hand side. There are also some, as you can see at the bottom there, with a red square or whatever it is, pink square. And those were the ones that remained single throughout their lives that I was able to find. The basis for this information is up at the top in the notes field, and that's readily available that you can read at your convenience. But this sort of gives you a feel for, and the reason that I put the first names and surnames in brackets is because Maria Rye and ultimately the Church of England Waifs and Strays Society used initials, as I mentioned earlier. And so the information in the brackets after each of those initials is actually the information that I've picked up from the ship's manifests, and been able to compare each of the ship's manifests to the initials, names, and ages in order to come up with this compilation.
Just imagine the work.
Yes, you're right. I heard that. I agree. So this just gives you an example of the sort of information that's already there. You're welcome to just look at it at your convenience. It's open material, and if you want to research it, it actually downloads directly onto your computer. So it just gives you a lot of information. In some cases, these children were placed in multiple locations, and some of that information is recorded, but in many cases, it was not recorded. So, in a sort of a broad summary of the first set of databases, first database, I should say, a little over 5,500 were Maria Rye children, and about 85% of those were girls. The Church of England Waifs and Stray Society from 1897 to right up to the First World War. Those were almost all girls. And then I mentioned to you about the the secondary database that's been put together as well. The other reason I guess I did this work is because the immigration piece alone, the first piece that I did in 2018, which gave us the 5,300 kids, really only deals with about a 6-month segment of somebody's life. And what I wanted to do was to take it all the way to death, actually, and figure out how many kids did these married women have, and you know, what were the occupation. I'll show you that in a moment. All right, so here's an example of the database of the married British home children. You can see the age, the date of arrival, the age at arrival, the age at which they had their first child, the number of children that they had, their age at death, their occupation of their husband, the birthplace of their husband. And you will notice that a very large number of the husbands were probably also British home children. There was clearly a Bush tom-tom in those days around every neighborhood about who were British home children and who weren't, even though there was a stigma associated with it. Those who had the stigma certainly knew who each other were. And we've had various counties in Ontario looking for who lived in their county. You know, the area around Sarnia, for example, has asked me for, you know, who was placed out in their area. Now we have that sort of information to look at, you know, where they were actually placed and lived. You will also see, it may be not so obvious on this page, but you will also see in the document quite a lot of people, in both documents actually, quite a lot of British home children that were sent to the United States, mostly to Western New York. In other words, the greater Buffalo area. There was quite a lot of movement there, but you know, some of the kids actually went as far as Louisiana. And in much later days, some children went all the way to the prairie provinces. So the Doyle report I mentioned that stalled everything in about I can't see it, 1874, I think it was. I can't see the right-hand side of my screen, so it's the only thing I've got a problem with here. Let me move that just a minute. Yeah, that's better. It started again in 1877, and that's when, as I said, the initials became significant. Okay. What else can I say? Oh, one other thing that might be interesting to some people is that there were quite a lot of people who came over using Maria Rye as a chaperone service. What I mean by that was that young girls were effectively coming over with a large family, and the family didn't want to bring the entire family together. So what they would do is they'd send out two of their older girls for a year or two in Canada. So they got used to the place, they could write a letter home and so on and so forth. And those two girls needed to get to Ontario, and Maria Rye would make that happen. But they were typically of the same age as the other British home children, and they are included in the list of British home children. The other thing I did was in the marriage project that I took on, I only used ancestry.ca or Ancestry to conduct the study for all the information. If I'd gone to other sources as well, frankly, it would have taken me more years. And I thought 2 years was quite long enough just for the second part of the project. Just carry on a minute. Let me get to the next. Oh, what happened here? Yes, this is just simply a list of the single or unmarried people that I've proven remain single. This is a list of typically of the sources that I used. Obviously, Ship's Manifest was a big one, but her annual reports, the government reports, the census, in some cases, census records, because the more I could provide of the link between who was in Britain and who was in Canada makes things easier for people later. By the way, for every one of the 3,000, every one of the 5,000, except for the singles, all the married ones for sure, I know, have a family tree that I have in my files that I created of that person. So I actually, if somebody calls me and says, tell me a bit about this particular person, I already have a starter for that information. I would say, by the way, that you know, I do stand on the shoulders of some incredible people before me, who actually, in some cases, worked in the days before the internet. You know, Gail Collins and the people at Waterloo University and the two tailors here in Niagara on the Lake did extraordinary work at a time when everything was done by post, and it was just amazing what they came up with. There's not a whole lot of stuff in the University of Liverpool Library, but there is some. We've just recently tried to try them out on something, and they don't have a lot of information. We here have way more information than they have in Britain, which is why 2 months ago I gave this same presentation to a group in Southeast England and Wales, because they didn't have this information. This is the research report. It goes on for several pages, but it just gives you a broad sort of history, and then it goes into sources and so on and so forth, that lays out how I did what I did in the way of this work. In addition to that, I've done my best to collect from the families, because in many cases with Ancestry, I am able to communicate with a descendant of the family. And as a result of that, I've been able to get about 200 so far photographs of these people, which is really helpful. So you'll start to see names here that you might recognize. Vanderlip, you know, Woodruff, Reed. I mean, there are maybe other names here that makes it, but I mean, I have a whole array of photographs now that we didn't have before. And so that's been extremely helpful. In addition to which, the lady Doris Hillier Shepherd was alive long enough to be interviewed 3 times, and we have at the museum the notes, the text of her discussions with us at the time. So it's nice to get a view of what it was like to go through our Western home as a British home child, which, by the way, was not like, this is not a residential home. I mean, let's be clear, British home children were placed within typically a week of coming to Canada. They weren't here for long periods of time to get trained. That training was assumed to have been done before they got here to a large extent. And as it turns out, Doris Hillier was also the cook for a long time at our Western home. So we know a little bit about what went on there too. Okay. The museum here has a number of boxes that this is a typical box of a British home child. This happens to be Carolyn Newbold. Unfortunately, she died and she's buried in St. Mark's Church here. That was really sad. Her sister, however, decided, I think, to return to England. There were some people who did that, and she got married there and has kids that had kids there. There's another group in Canada that has done a fair amount of work on British home children and is probably today the leading advocate of British home children in Canada. They currently call themselves, by the way, Home Children Canada, and I'll mention that in a moment. So they did change their name fairly recently, but their work is incredible. We'll get to that. Here we go. They've recorded, I think they're either at or approaching 100,000 kids so far. There'll probably be, I would imagine, somewhere like, we'll probably end up with 150,000 kids. I don't know what the number will be eventually, but it'd be something in that order. That's boys and girls now in Canada, and those that went to the US as well. But when they went to the US, they came via Canada. This is an example of what you'll see on Library and Archives Canada's site. So you can go there if you want to, but the reality is what you get there is updated already on the Niagara on the Lake Museum site. The reason they stopped in the First World War is pretty obvious. I think there was going to be a long period of time where the First World War was going to take over when it became very obvious by 1915. And so the home was closed. It became then the building used for the Polish officers who were being trained here in Niagara Camp during the First World War. Maria Rye's sister opened a home in Toronto in 1924, but it had closed a decade later. That building is now designated thanks to Home Children Canada. And and anything in the way of information on the Church of England Waifs and Strays Society, today that's called the Children's Society in England. And they do have information, but it takes a while to get it. So, you know, what happened with these kids? You know, it's like the rest of us. Some of us do really well and some of us don't. And it's sad, but that's the way it is sometimes. If, you know, you have a disease that you can't get rid of and you die from it, you know, you don't have a long life and lots of kids. There are a few children on a gravestone in St. Mark's Cemetery, as you'll see there, of some of those that didn't make it. But then there were other people such as Florence Passmore here at the top, who did extremely well and had a wonderful family life. And so there's really a broad range of people. And what I wanted to do was concentrate on those that married and ultimately, for a period of time before the Hong Kong group came into Canada, I believe something in the order of 1 in 6 Canadians was somehow related to a British home child. It was a very large number. And I've also discovered since doing this work that there are many, many people who do not know that their grandmother or great-grandmother were actually a British home child. It's been amazing and a bit of a surprise to a number of people that their great-grandmother was one. And so, but you know, and the other thing is that the information that I've done for Niagara on the Lake is just one very small part. Obviously, it's only 5,000 out of, you know, it's less than 5% of the total number of British home children that came over. And for example, if you wanted to do the same job for Hamilton, they had about 5,000 kids that went there. And there's a home there for that for that same purpose. and so on and so forth. So to my knowledge, this was the only home of this size in the Niagara Peninsula, other than Hamilton, which is sort of on the edge. The other homes are all on the north side of the lake, and run by other organizations. I'd be happy to tell you who those are. Some of them were already in one of the slides I've already shown. So if you want information about particularly girls, the information you should start with is right here on that web address. If you just simply look it up on the internet and the browser, you'll probably find it anyway. It's under research in the Niagara and the Lake Museum website. And if anybody wants to contact me about anything at all with regard to this, that's my email address. Thank you for attending.
Thank you. Did you unmute?
I did.
Any questions? How do we?
Well, David, I think we a couple of questions went your way in the chat.
Okay. Did I get those chat questions? Let me look.
Yeah, I forwarded them on to you.
Ah, okay. Let me see what they say. Did they receive a small? Yes. When children got to the age of 14, they started to get a very, for many of them, not all of them, but for many of them, got a very small sum of money for, I don't know, maybe, something that they would want. By the time they got to 18, they were making probably something in the order of half or a third of what they should have been making in other words, the moment they turned 18 as an adult, their compensation would have gone up 2 to 3-fold. If that gives you an answer. Some placements actually withheld their payments to these kids and paid it all out at the time they were 18. The problem with that is very obvious. Not everybody lives up to their promises. So that's the first question. Does that answer that question? Are we okay there, Vicky? Did any sets or siblings? Oh, yes. Sets and siblings did come to Canada. There were 2 types of siblings, the sisters that came through Maria Rye, and then occasionally there would be, a boy coming from, say, Bernardo's or Vegan Homes or one of the others, and you'd have the girl coming through the Rye organization. Although when they come through different organizations, there was no chance of being able to be assured of where they would be placed to be close to each other. Maria Rye herself tried very hard to at least keep sisters within the same county, so that there was an opportunity for them to visit with each other occasionally. In some cases, it was very obvious that the sisters did not want to be close together, in which case they were separated. You could tell sometimes from the way they signed in at the ship or in some other places. But nevertheless, unfortunately, siblings are siblings, and they'll go whichever way they choose. That's the next question here.
Gail, do you have your hand up there? We can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Yes, I was muted. Thank you, David Hemmings. That was very, very interesting to me. I've done my own small research on Maria Rye myself, but in 1995, I went to Chatham with the Ontario Genealogical Society, where they were holding the first meeting that I had ever been aware of about the home children. David Laurent of Ottawa, I'm sure his name means something to you,
Yeah.
was the presenter, and the room, the large room, was just packed. And he had about 4 or 5 people there who had been home children, and I remember one man in front of me, right in front of me, he was 95 or 92, sorry, stood up. They all stood up, and people were amazed and heartbroken about these stories, which is the first time we'd heard about it.
Yep.
I belong to the Somerset Dorset Family History Society and have for 40 years. And I took all of the information from that meeting over to England, to the Somerset Dorset branch, and I presented it to them. They had no idea. This is in 1995.
Yeah, that's true.
They had absolutely no idea.
They don't today either. You're right.
Yeah, that's
I
all.
I would say this, that the British home children that you saw were latter day, whatever you want to call it. British home children. I mean, we're dealing in a time of a higher degree of severity of life. I don't know what words to use, but for children back in the 19th century, all the way back to 1870 or thereabouts. And the people who came over in the 20s and 30s came from, first of all, a very different environment and were living in a very different time than the people in the 1870s, 80s, and
for sure,
even
for
90s.
My husband's family has two brothers who were on the first Barnardo ship ever. But I mean, that's unrelated to your topic. But it was in 1995. I was so surprised that of any of this information, and that the English knew nothing about it.
Right. It's true.
Thank you for a great talk.
We tend to tend to brush things under the carpet, don't we?
We do.
Yeah. Any other? What else can I?
Yeah, I can build on that story as well. John Webb here. I did some research very similar. I was looking at the Cornish, how the Cornish sort of workhouses had dealt with this question. But the whole topic is amazing. As you say, nobody in England knows about this. If you go to England and talk, well, the word home children doesn't mean anything. The word Dr. Barnardo means a lot to them, but not in the same way as this. But we've got about, at least, as you mentioned, 100,000 names. And I saw the numbers that's 10%. The children are now 10% of the Canadian population. So
let me turn that around a minute. 1.5% of all kids in Britain went through this program.
Wow. Okay.
That gives you an idea. I mean, that doesn't sound like a big number, 1.5%, but it's a huge number to scoop out of the urban areas of Britain.
But I'll challenge that a little bit, and certainly you focused on the slums of the big cities. But when I did my research in Cornwall and the workhouses there, the workhouse, the local government, what are they called, the LGAs, were happy to send the children off to one of these, particularly Dr. Barnardo. It was cheaper. They would pay for the transportation cost to get them out of their parish. So they were coming from the rural areas. You had Merthyr Tydfil there as well. But it wasn't just the big cities that we rescued the children from. But the other thing, of course, is you will find, and you have found, that people don't know that their ancestors were home children because the stigma was so bad. And I know, did some of you watch the TVO program just within the last year on that, where they did interview somebody? The stigma of being a home children had been ingrained, beaten into them because they were slum kids. They were just ruffians that came over. and the Canadians weren't welcome. They used them as slaves. So we don't have a lot to we don't have a lot to be proud of.
Well,
So-
certainly home children were viewed in the same category as illegitimates
Mm,
and the rest. So yeah, they were really shunned in many cases by a lot of the community.
yeah. I've got a cemetery in Toronto that's got 75 children buried. They were in for a while until the Home Children Society, the Ottawa group, got their hands on this information. They were in unmarked graves. It was a horrible story. But there were success stories. You've got to admit that. But there were some horrible stories. Thank you, and thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
So are there any more questions? Just trying to scroll down and see if anyone else. Bob,
Bob Hatfield.
you're on mute. Okay. Oh,
Whoops.
yeah, you're
I
good.
have a comment. Did you know that Maria Rye brought out at least one boy? My first wife's grandfather was a homeboy, and my mother-in-law never knew who brought him, what organization he came out with. But Marjorie Coley found his name on a list that Maria Rye brought out, and she found the rest of the story.
Well, it should be on
So I
my,
don't know how many others. It was in the early 1870s. Without looking up my notes, I can't tell you the exact year.
yes, there was
but-
one year back then when there were a lot of boys.
Pardon?
There was 1 year back then when there were a lot of boys that were brought out by Maria Rye.
Well,
And,
he was there. He was one, and I have
and I think I think it will be on my database.
the family researched.
Okay.
So it was an interesting family because he had some
If you care
very
to,
interesting grandchildren.
if you care to send me the information, the name of the person, I might be able to just,
I don't know who was, he was first sent to a farm up near Fergus.
yeah.
And they sent him back because they said it wasn't big enough. And then they placed him with a monument maker in Newcastle, Ontario. And they treated him like their own, and he learned that trade. And that was a very successful one.
Yep. Well,
Just-
there were a lot
Actually,
of-
I wrote an article about him in OGS Families.
Good. Good.
Hmm.
Well, if you care to share with me the name of the person on my email, I would be I'd be pleased to know about it. Because I'm always looking for descending families of those that are on the list, particularly. And by the way, occasionally we found one or two that were not on the list and should have been. So, for example, I recently found a group of 4 or 5 British home children that had been brought over by themselves, probably supervised by one of the other groups that were coming at the same time, but they were for Maria Rye specifically. And I didn't know about it until I found one of them. And when I found the one, I found the others as well.
I presume you've been through all the local church registers.
Which church
I
rec?
think in the Homer Anglican, I think there were several obvious homegirls were married there.
Well, if I've not done that, that's a fair amount of work to do that for 5,300. So I don't know how you do it quickly.
Well, thank you. I don't know how soon I'll get it to you. I've noted your email address and I will send you.
That'd be
probably
great.
I'll probably just send you my article that I've had in families.
That would be great. Thank you. As I say, if anybody wants any information downstream, I'd be delighted to help out. I do a fair amount of work of this type. I get probably an email a week, sometimes two, specifically asking me to try to put together the material on any one British home child. So the numbers continue to grow while I'm doing this. But I mean, as I said to you before, you know, we are looking at, you know, the eastern end of the Niagara Peninsula. I'm not trying to, I can't really offer a lot on Bernardo homes or Marchmont homes or some of the other homes that were out there, because that's a different group of people.
I think that's it for questions. I don't see any
Okay.
now. I know I can tell you from my personal experiences quickly. I remember once the job I do, I remember I was trying to look up a statute. I think it was the Business Corporations Act, but right above it was a statute called, it's called the British Home Child Day Act 2011. It was a
Right.
statute passed by the Ontario government in 2011. And it's an interesting statute. It just goes on for a couple of paragraphs to say why they're commemorating it. And it's actually I think it designates, it says, yeah, September 28th in each year is proclaimed as British Home Child Day.
Right. Yep.
So it's on the statute. How many of us knew about that? And I said, I discovered it by accident, but I've always thought about that. Yeah. So,
Yep.
but anyways, like you said, not an area which has got a lot of recognition, but no doubt we appreciate all the research you put into it. That really contributes a lot to our understanding. And judging by the amount of people who are here today, I think a lot of people are really interested in the topic. So as always, David, I want to thank you for your presentation. You've done
You're
many
welcome.
for us, and you've never let us down once. So your streak continues. So
Right.
thank you again. And yeah, look forward to one day having you again.
Thank you very much, everybody.
you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Okay. Right. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.